Elena grew up in a small coastal town where the biggest event of the week was the Sunday fish market. Her mother ran a tiny flower shop on the corner of Harbor Street, and from the time Elena could walk, she was surrounded by the smell of roses, lilies, and fresh-cut stems. She learned to arrange flowers before she learned to ride a bicycle. Her father had passed away when she was young, so it was just her and her mother, working side by side every morning before the sun was even fully up, wrapping bouquets for weddings, funerals, birthdays, and every ordinary day in between. She never dreamed of palaces. She never imagined guards, crowns, or royal titles. Her world was simple. Wake up early, open the shop, greet the regular customers by name, close up at sunset, and fall asleep tired but content. She liked her life. She liked knowing exactly who she was and where she belonged. That all changed the night of the Harbor City Charity Gala. Her mother's shop had been chosen to supply the flowers for a large fundraising event that year, an honor that came with plenty of stress and very little sleep. Elena spent 3 days preparing centerpieces, garlands, and a massive floral arch for the entrance. On the night of the event, she went herself to make sure everything was set up properly, planning to slip out quietly once the guests arrived. She wore a simple green dress, nothing fancy, and stood near the floral arch double-checking that none of the flowers had wilted in the evening heat. That was where she first saw him. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that looked slightly less stiff than the other men around him, as if he had loosened his tie the moment no one important was watching. He was talking to an elderly couple near the drink table, laughing at something one of them said, completely at ease. Elena assumed he was just another wealthy guest, someone whose name she would never bother to learn. She had no idea he was the Crown Prince of Aldenmark until one of the event organizers rushed past her, whispering nervously about protocol and where His Royal Highness should be seated. Elena nearly dropped the vase she was holding. She tried to stay out of sight for the rest of the evening, weaving between tables, adjusting flower arrangements, avoiding eye contact with anyone who looked important. But halfway through the night, as she was fixing a centerpiece that had tipped over, a voice behind her said, "You did all of this yourself." She turned around, and there he was, standing a little too close, looking at the flowers instead of at her, which somehow made the question feel less intimidating. "My mother and I did," she said. "It's our shop." "It's beautiful," he said. "Most events like this look the same every year. This one actually feels different." She laughed before she could stop herself. "Different how? It's just flowers." "Everything is just something until someone puts real care into it," he said. "You can tell when someone cares. Most people don't." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went back to adjusting the stems, very aware that he hadn't walked away yet. They talked for almost 20 minutes that night, though neither of them noticed the time passing. He asked about her shop, her mother, the town she grew up in. She asked him nothing about being a prince, mostly because she still couldn't quite believe it, and partly because he didn't seem to want to talk about that at all. When he finally had to leave to greet other guests, he thanked her for the flowers and told her, quite plainly, that he hoped he would see her again. She assumed that was simply something people like him said to be polite. She was wrong. 3 days later, a car arrived outside her mother's shop. Not a fancy motorcade, just a single black car with tinted windows, and inside it was him, dressed in ordinary clothes, looking slightly out of place on Harbor Street. He said he had been thinking about their conversation and wanted to know if she would like to get coffee sometime, as two regular people, no titles involved. Elena's mother nearly fainted when she found out who had been standing in her shop. That first coffee date was awkward in the way first dates usually are, except with the added strangeness of two bodyguards standing near the door pretending to look at a menu they had already memorized. Matthias apologized for them twice, clearly embarrassed, and Elena found herself laughing at how normal he seemed underneath all of it. He spilled his coffee within the first 10 minutes. He didn't know how to use the little sugar packets at first, admitting sheepishly that someone else usually made his coffee for him. Elena teased him mercilessly about it, and he took the teasing well, grinning the whole time like a man who hadn't been laughed at in a long while and had missed it. Most people are careful with me, he admitted that day, stirring his coffee slowly. They agree with everything I say. They laugh at things that aren't even funny. It gets exhausting if I'm honest. I won't do that, Elena said. Fair warning. I was hoping you'd say that. What began as coffee turned into long walks along the harbor, quiet dinners in restaurants far from the palace, and phone calls that stretched late into the night. Matthias, as she came to call him, was nothing like what she expected a prince to be. He hated formal events, disliked being called Your Highness by people he actually cared about, and would rather sit on a dock eating cheap street food than attend another stiff royal dinner. Elena found herself falling for him slowly, carefully, the way you fall for someone when you're trying very hard not to. For almost a year, they kept their relationship quiet, not secret exactly, but private. Matthias didn't want the media circus to swallow something that still felt new and fragile. Elena didn't want her ordinary life turned into a headline before she even understood what was happening between them. But nothing stays private forever, especially not when you're dating the future king. A photographer caught them together outside a small restaurant one evening, and within 2 days, the story was everywhere. Prince Matthias's secret girlfriend, a florist from Harbor City. The palace press office was flooded with questions. Reporters showed up outside her mother's shop. Strangers recognized her in the grocery store. Her quiet life disappeared almost overnight. For the first few weeks, Elena barely left the house. She wasn't used to strangers taking her photograph while she bought bread, or reporters asking her mother questions through the shop window, or seeing her own face on the evening news standing next to a headline she never agreed to. Matthias called her every night during that stretch, sometimes just to sit on the phone in silence with her, because neither of them had the energy to talk. He offered, more than once, to slow things down, to give her space to decide if this life was really something she wanted. I didn't fall for the palace, she told him one night. I fell for a man who spills his coffee and hates his own bodyguards standing too close. I just need a little time to get used to the noise around him. It took her about 2 months to stop flinching every time a camera flashed nearby. During that stretch, her oldest friend from Harbor City, a woman named Priya who had worked beside her at the flower shop since they were both teenagers, showed up unannounced one evening with a bag of takeout and refused to talk about the prince at all for the entire visit. I'm not here for him, Priya said, setting containers of food on the kitchen table. I'm here because you look like you haven't slept properly in a week, and someone needs to make you eat something that isn't wedding cake samples. They spent the evening exactly the way they used to before any of this started, sitting on the floor, eating out of containers, talking about nothing important. It was, Elena admitted later, the first night in weeks she had actually laughed without thinking about a single headline. By the time she felt steady enough to face the world again, she had also learned something else about the life she was stepping into. Not everyone in the family was going to make it easy for her. It was around this time that Elena first met Isolde. Isolde was Matthias's older sister, and from the very first meeting, it was clear she did not approve. She arrived at the family dinner, arranged to formally introduce Elena, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her expression polite but distant, the kind of politeness that felt more like a warning than a welcome. She asked Elena a series of questions that sounded innocent on the surface, but carried a clear edge underneath. So you arrange flowers, Isolde said, swirling the wine in her glass. That must be a lovely little hobby. It's my job, Elena said carefully. My family's business. Of course, Isolde said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. It's just interesting, isn't it? The contrast. Some people spend their lives learning statecraft, languages, history, diplomacy. Others learn how to tie a ribbon around a bouquet. The table went quiet. Matthias opened his mouth to say something, but Elena spoke first, calm and steady. Both take years to learn well, she said. I imagine ribbons are easier to forgive when you get them wrong. The king, sitting at the head of the table, let out a short laugh he tried to hide behind his napkin. Isolde's smile tightened, but she said nothing more on the subject that night. From that dinner onward, the tension between Elena and Isolde never really went away. It wasn't loud or dramatic, Not at first. It showed up in small ways. Isolde would forget to invite Elena to certain family gatherings. She would make comments to reporters about preserving the values of the crown that were vague enough to deny, but pointed enough for everyone to understand who she meant. She once told a magazine, in an interview about an unrelated charity project, that she believed some traditions exist for good reason, and marriage into the royal family is one of the most serious decisions a family can make, not something to be taken lightly by outsiders. There was a garden party, about a year into Elena's relationship with Matthias, where Isolde's coolness slipped into something sharper. Elena had spent weeks helping design the floral displays for the event, mostly because she couldn't help herself, and the arrangements had drawn genuine compliments from several guests throughout the afternoon. Isolde found Elena near one of the tables and admired the flowers loudly enough for a small cluster of guests to hear. "You really do have a talent for this," Isolde said. "It's a shame it can't translate to anything more substantial. Flowers wilt after all. Nothing you make ever really lasts." Elena kept her voice light. "Neither do speeches, from what I understand, or promises, sometimes. At least my flowers are honest about how long they'll last." A few guests nearby laughed quietly before pretending they hadn't heard anything, and Isolde walked away without another word, her jaw tight. It became a kind of pattern between them, Isolde delivering a quiet, polished insult wrapped in a compliment, and Elena refusing to let it land the way it was meant to. Matthias apologized for his sister more times than Elena could count, always offering to speak to her directly, and Elena always told him not to bother. "She's not going to change because you ask her to," Elena said once. "She'll change when she wants to, or she won't. Either way, I'm not going anywhere." Elena tried not to let it get to her. She focused on her relationship with Matthias, on the family members who did welcome her, especially the Queen, who took a quiet liking to Elena almost immediately. The Queen would often invite her for tea, away from the noise of the palace, and tell her stories about her own early days marrying into the family, how hard it had been, how much easier it became once she stopped trying to win over everyone and focused instead on the people who actually mattered. "Isolde will come around," the Queen said once, stirring her tea slowly. "Or she won't. Either way, you cannot build your happiness around her approval." Elena held on to those words tightly over the following 2 years. Matthias proposed on a quiet evening at the same harbor where they used to take their walks, far from cameras, far from the palace. He got down on one knee on the same dock where he had once eaten street food in his ordinary clothes, and Elena said yes before he even finished the question. The engagement announcement caused an uproar across the country. Newspapers ran polls asking whether the public approved of a commoner marrying into the royal family. Talk shows debated it for weeks. Most of the public, especially younger people, seemed genuinely happy for them, charmed by the story of a florist who had captured the heart of a prince who clearly loved her for who she was, rather than what she represented. But there was also a smaller, louder group, deeply attached to tradition, who felt that Elena's background made her unfit for royal life. Elena tried, for a while, to read everything written about her, every comment, every opinion piece. Matthias eventually took her phone away one evening, gently, and told her the same thing her mother had told her years earlier, without either of them ever comparing notes. "You can't build a life around convincing strangers you deserve to be happy," he said. "At some point, you just have to let yourself be happy, and let the noise sort itself out." She listened to him, mostly. She stopped reading the comment sections. She kept the phone calls with old friends from Harbor City, the ones who still teased her the same way they always had, who reminded her, without meaning to, of exactly who she was before any of this started. Her mother, for her part, handled the sudden fame with far more grace than Elena expected. She gave one brief interview to a local paper, mostly to correct a few inaccurate details about the flower shop's history, and otherwise declined every other request, choosing instead to keep running her shop exactly as she always had, flowers first, everything else second. Isolde never publicly criticized the engagement. She was too careful for that. but she also never publicly supported it, and in a family where every gesture is analyzed by the press, her silence spoke volumes. What almost no one knew, not even Matthias, was that Isolde had far bigger problems than her brother's choice of bride. 2 years earlier, Isolde had taken over management of the Aldenmark Children's Future Trust, a charitable fund established generations ago to support education programs for underprivileged children across the country. It was meant to be a symbolic role, mostly ceremonial, but Isolde, eager to prove herself as more than just a decorative royal figure, had taken it seriously, perhaps too seriously. She began making investment decisions with the trust's funds, moving money into private ventures she believed would grow the charity's resources significantly. Some of her advisors warned her the investments were risky. She ignored them, confident in her own judgment, the way people often are when they've never truly failed at anything before. The investments collapsed. Not all at once, but steadily, over 18 months, wiping out a significant portion of the trust's funds. Terrified of the humiliation that would follow, and unwilling to admit her mistake, Isolde began quietly moving money between accounts to hide the losses, forging signatures on financial documents that should have required approval from 2 other trust officers. She told herself it was temporary, that she would find a way to earn the money back before anyone noticed, that she just needed more time. One of the trust officers, an older man named Bernard who had worked for the family for over 20 years, later admitted during the investigation that he had noticed a few strange figures in the quarterly reports almost a year before the scandal broke. He said he had raised the issue once, gently, in a private meeting with Isolde, and she had brushed it off so confidently, with such a clear explanation about a temporary reallocation strategy, that he had simply trusted her and moved on. He would later say it was the worst professional mistake of his career, though nobody blamed him for it. Isolde had always been convincing when she wanted to be. In the months before her secret unraveled, Isolde had grown increasingly isolated, even within her own family. She turned down invitations to small gatherings, claiming exhaustion or prior commitments, when in truth she simply couldn't bear to sit across from people she was actively deceiving. She snapped at staff over minor mistakes. She stopped returning calls from old friends who noticed she seemed distracted and distant. Even the Queen, who rarely pried into her children's private affairs, mentioned once at dinner that Isolde seemed unlike herself lately, tired, in a way that sleep didn't seem to fix. Isolde brushed off the concern each time, insisting she was simply busy with trust responsibilities, which was, in its own twisted way, technically true. She did not have more time. An anonymous letter reached the king's private financial council roughly 8 months before Elena and Matthias's wedding, raising concerns about irregular transactions within the trust. The council launched a quiet internal audit, working carefully and privately to avoid triggering a public scandal before they had solid proof. Isolde had no idea the investigation was underway. She continued attending public events, continued making pointed comments about tradition and family values, continued treating Elena with the same cool distance she always had, all while her carefully built house of forged signatures and hidden transfers slowly came apart under the auditor's careful eyes. The wedding date arrived before the investigation was fully complete. The king and his council debated what to do. Delaying the wedding would raise questions before they were ready to act. Confronting Isolde too early might give her time to destroy evidence or flee the country entirely. In the end, they decided to let the wedding proceed as planned, while quietly finalizing the last pieces of evidence in the background, intending to deal with Isolde privately after the ceremony, away from the cameras, away from the guests, in a manner that would protect the dignity of the crown. Isolde, of course, knew nothing of this plan. What she did know, in the final weeks before the wedding, was that her carefully constructed life was slipping through her fingers. Her debts were mounting. Her excuses to the trust officers were wearing thin. And in the middle of all this personal collapse, she watched her younger brother prepare to marry a florist from Harbor City in front of the entire country, a woman Isolde had spent 2 years trying, quietly and unsuccessfully, to push out of the family. Something in her snapped. She barely slept during that final week. She would lie awake calculating numbers she already knew by heart, trying to find some version of the math that made her debts disappear. During the day, she smiled through wedding preparations, attended fittings for a bridesmaid role she had reluctantly agreed to months earlier, and nodded along in meetings about seating arrangements, all while feeling, as she later admitted, like she was watching her own life happen from somewhere just outside her body. She decided, in the days leading up to the wedding, that she would not simply sit in the audience and watch. She would make a statement. She would remind everyone, in the most public way possible, that she was the one who had grown up in the palace, the one who understood tradition, the one who had sacrificed her entire life for the crown, while a woman who sold flowers for a living was about to become a princess. She ordered a custom gown from a designer she trusted to keep quiet. Pure white, full length, a veil. She told the designer it was for a formal portrait session, nothing more, and swore the small team to secrecy, under threat of losing future palace commissions. The designer, an older woman who had dressed members of the royal family for over a decade, later admitted she had found the request strange from the start. Portrait sessions rarely called for a full bridal veil, and something about the way Isolde had insisted on absolute secrecy, checking twice that no sketches or fabric samples would leave the workshop, made her uneasy. She considered mentioning it to someone in the palace communications office, but ultimately talked herself out of it, telling herself it wasn't her place to question a member of the royal family about her own choice of dress. It was a decision she would think about often in the weeks that followed, wondering if things might have gone differently had she simply made one phone call. Elena, meanwhile, spent the final weeks before the wedding in a blur of fittings, rehearsals, and quiet nerves. She wasn't nervous about marrying Matthias. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. She was nervous about the wedding itself, about standing in front of 800 guests, about representing a country she had only recently become a part of, about the weight of expectations that came with a title she never asked for but had grown, slowly, to accept. The night before the wedding, her mother sat with her in her room at the palace, the same way she used to sit with her in the back room of the flower shop after a long day. "Are you scared?" her mother asked. "A little," Elena admitted. "Not of him, never of him. Just everything else." Her mother took her hand. "You know what I've always told you about flowers. It doesn't matter how grand the venue is or how many people are watching. What matters is whether the arrangement is honest, whether it means something. Everything else is just noise." Before she left, her mother reached into her bag and pulled out a small, slightly worn ribbon, the same pale yellow ribbon she used to tie around the first bouquet Elena ever sold as a young girl, kept safe in a drawer for over 15 years. "I want you to carry this tomorrow," her mother said, pressing it into Elena's palm. "Tied around your bouquet, somewhere no one will notice but you, so that no matter how big that cathedral is or how many people are watching, some part of you is still standing behind the counter of our little shop." Elena held the ribbon tightly and didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. She simply nodded and hugged her mother goodnight. Elena held on to those words as she fell asleep that night, and she would need them more than she realized the very next day. The morning of the wedding began early, the palace alive with movement long before sunrise. Elena sat in front of a mirror as a team of stylists worked around her, weaving small white flowers into her hair, adjusting the folds of her ivory gown, checking and rechecking every detail with the kind of precision reserved for events broadcast to millions of people. She could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd gathering outside the cathedral, distant applause as early guests arrived, the occasional flash of a camera reflecting faintly through the curtains. She thought about the first night she met Matthias, standing awkwardly by a floral arch in a simple green dress, never imagining any of this. She thought about her father, who had passed away long before any of this began, and wondered what he would think, seeing his daughter about to become a princess. She thought about her mother, waiting just outside the room, dressed in a soft blue gown, tears already threatening at the corners of her eyes. At one point, a young stylist, carefully pinning flowers into her hair, asked, quietly, if she was nervous. Elena thought about it honestly before answering. "Not about marrying him," she said. "About everything else, maybe a little, but not about him." The stylist smiled and kept working, and Elena caught her own reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing herself in the gown, the flowers, the careful makeup meant to photograph well under bright lights. For a brief second, she missed the simplicity of Harbor Street so sharply it almost hurt. Then she remembered the ribbon tied quietly around the base of her bouquet, hidden beneath the roses, and the feeling passed. She did not think about Isolde, not once. There was no reason to. By the time Elena arrived at the Cathedral of Saint Deverell, the building was full beyond capacity, every pew occupied by dignitaries, foreign guests, extended royal relatives, and journalists carefully positioned in the accredited press area along the upper balcony. The air smelled of white lilies and candle wax. Sunlight poured through the tall stained glass windows, scattering colored light across the stone floor. Somewhere near the back, a young cousin of Matthias's fidgeted in his small formal suit, waving at Elena through the crowd, and she found herself smiling, despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. Her mother squeezed her arm gently, whispering that everything looked exactly as beautiful as they had hoped it would when they first started planning the flowers together, months earlier, at the kitchen table above the shop. Matthias stood at the altar in his formal uniform, and even from a distance, Elena could see him fidgeting slightly with his sleeve, a nervous habit she had teased him about 100 times before. The string quartet began to play, and the enormous cathedral doors opened. Elena stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on her mother's arm, and began the long walk down the aisle. She made it exactly 3 steps before the murmuring started. It began near the front, a ripple of whispers spreading backward through the crowd, like wind moving through tall grass. Elena's first instinct was to think something had gone wrong with the ceremony itself, some technical issue, some forgotten detail. Then she saw the side door near the front of the cathedral open, and Isolde stepped through it. She was wearing white. Not off-white, not ivory, not a pale cream that could be mistaken for a mistake. A full, stark, unmistakable bridal white, complete with a long veil pinned elegantly into her hair and a bouquet of white roses held delicately in front of her. She walked to a reserved seat in the second row with the calm, deliberate steps of someone who had rehearsed this exact entrance many times in front of a mirror. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked straight ahead, the picture of composed serenity. The whispering grew louder. Guests exchanged confused, uncomfortable glances. Several of the foreign dignitaries, unfamiliar with Aldenmark's strict customs around wedding attire, simply looked puzzled. But every native guest in that cathedral understood exactly what they were witnessing. In Aldenmark, for over 3 centuries, no woman other than the bride was permitted to wear white to a royal wedding. It was considered the gravest possible insult a woman could deliver to a bride on her wedding day, a public claim of rivalry, a declaration that she believed herself the rightful woman standing at that altar. Elena felt her stomach drop through the floor. For one terrible moment, standing frozen in the doorway of the cathedral, with every eye now split between her and the woman in white, sitting calmly in the second row, Elena considered turning around and walking straight back out. Her hands trembled slightly around her bouquet. Her mother squeezed her arm gently, silently asking if she wanted to stop. Elena looked toward the altar. Matthias was staring at his sister, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides, clearly just as blindsided as everyone else. But then his eyes found Elena's, and in that single look, she saw everything she needed to see. He wasn't embarrassed by her. He wasn't doubting her. He was furious on her behalf, and he was waiting for her, exactly where he had always been waiting for her, regardless of what his sister was trying to do. Near the front of the cathedral, the queen sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed not on Isolde but on Elena, willing her, silently, to keep walking. She had grown fond of Elena over the past 2 years, in a way she hadn't expected to, and watching her stand frozen in the doorway, the queen felt an unfamiliar urge to stand up herself and do something, anything, though there was nothing to be done from where she sat except hope. The elderly bishop standing at the altar, a man who had personally guided 3 generations of the royal family through their most important ceremonies, caught Elena's eye from across the cathedral. He gave her the smallest, steadiest nod, the kind of nod that said, without a single word, that he had seen difficult days before, and that this was simply one more thing to walk through, not around. Elena took a breath, straightened her spine, and continued down the aisle. She refused to let Isolde's carefully staged moment define her wedding day. Every step forward felt heavier than it should have, every whisper from the crowd landing somewhere in her chest. But she kept her eyes forward, on Matthias, on the only person in that entire cathedral whose opinion of her had never once wavered. When she finally reached the altar, Matthias reached out and took both her hands in his thumbs brushing gently over her knuckles, a small private gesture meant only for her. "I'm right here," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear it. "Nothing she does changes anything." The ceremony continued, though the tension in the cathedral was impossible to fully shake off. Elena spoke her vows clearly, her voice only wavering slightly during the parts that mattered most, the parts about choosing him, about building a life together regardless of what anyone else believed they deserved. She spoke about the harbor, about the coffee he had spilled on their first date, about the countless small ordinary moments that had convinced her, slowly and completely, that this was the life she wanted. A few guests laughed softly at the coffee mention, and for a moment the heaviness in the cathedral lifted, just slightly. Matthias's own vows carried a quiet, steady anger beneath the tenderness, as if every word was also a promise that whatever his sister was trying to prove, it would not succeed. He spoke about the first time he saw her by the floral arch, about how she had been the first person in years to treat him like a person rather than a title, about how nothing that happened that day, or any day before it, would ever change what he felt for her. His voice cracked slightly on the final line of his vows, and Elena squeezed his hands tightly, blinking back tears she hadn't expected. When the bishop finally pronounced them husband and wife, applause broke out across the cathedral, warm and genuine from most of the guests. But it was noticeably thinner near the second row, where Isolde sat with her arms now crossed over her white gown, refusing to clap, her earlier serene composure slowly curdling into something colder, as she realized her dramatic entrance had not stopped the wedding at all. It was during the recessional, as Elena and Matthias walked back up the aisle as husband and wife for the very first time, smiling despite everything, that the rear doors of the cathedral opened again. This time, it was not a nervous wedding coordinator or a late guest. 4 members of the royal guard entered in tight formation, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unmistakably serious. For a brief moment, confused murmurs rippled through the crowd again, guests assuming this must be some part of the ceremonial procession they simply hadn't seen before. It was not. The guards moved directly toward the second row, where Isolde was still sitting in her white gown. Their leader, a stern, composed woman named Commander Reyes, stopped directly in front of her and spoke clearly enough for the surrounding rows to hear every word. "Princess Isolde, by order of the Crown's Financial Council, you are under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery of trust documents, and misappropriation of charitable funds." For a full second, nobody in the cathedral moved. Then Isolde shot to her feet, her white veil slipping sideways, her voice rising in disbelief. "This is absurd," she said, loud enough now for the entire front section to hear clearly. "You cannot possibly arrest me here, today, in front of everyone. There has been some mistake." "There is no mistake, Your Highness," Commander Reyes said, her tone calm but firm. "The Council's findings have been confirmed and approved directly by His Majesty." Isolde's eyes flew toward her father, seated in the front row, hoping desperately for some sign that this was some misunderstanding he would clear up immediately. The king did not move. He did not stand. He simply looked at his daughter with an expression of deep, quiet sadness, the look of a father who had hoped, until the very last possible moment, that the evidence in front of him was somehow wrong. It was not wrong. 2 guards stepped forward, and following a protocol reserved only for the most serious offenses committed by members of the nobility, secured her wrists in ceremonial restraint chains, a rarely used measure that signaled the charges had come directly from the highest levels of the Crown's private council rather than any lower court. As the guards led her past the rows of stunned guests, Isolde's eyes searched the crowd desperately for someone, anyone, willing to intervene on her behalf. No one moved. A few distant cousins looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. An elderly aunt near the aisle quietly crossed herself. Even the foreign dignitaries, unfamiliar with the exact nature of the charges, seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a moment to interrupt. Isolde was led out of the cathedral in her white gown, her veil now hanging loosely to one side, past the very same guests she had gathered specifically to witness what she had hoped would be her moment of triumph. Camera flashes exploded from the press balcony, capturing an image that would appear on the front page of nearly every newspaper in the country by the following morning. The silence that followed her exit was heavier than any applause could ever have been. Elena stood frozen at the top of the aisle, still holding her bouquet, still in her wedding gown, watching the doors of the cathedral swing shut behind the departing guards. Matthias turned to her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and something close to relief that it was finally, truly over. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, his hands finding hers again. "None of this was supposed to touch you, not today, not ever, really." Elena looked toward the closed doors, then back at him, and felt something inside her settle. Finally, after months of quiet tension she hadn't even fully realized she was carrying. "She wanted today to be about her," Elena said softly. "Let's not give her that." The reception continued that evening, and though the shadow of what had happened lingered in quiet conversations throughout the ballroom, Elena and Matthias made a deliberate choice not to let it dominate their first celebration as husband and wife. They danced, they laughed with old friends. Elena's mother cried happy tears during the father-daughter dance substitute, performed instead with the king himself, who had quietly requested the honor earlier that evening, a small gesture that meant more to Elena than almost anything else that day. At one point during the evening, the king pulled Elena aside briefly, away from the noise of the celebration, and apologized to her directly for what his daughter had done. "You did nothing to deserve this," he said. "Not today, and not for the 2 years before it. I should have addressed her behavior long before it reached this point, and I'm sorry it fell on your wedding day instead." Elena, still a little stunned by the events of the day, simply thanked him for his honesty. "Today still felt like mine," she said. "Every part that mattered anyway." The king nodded, seeming to relax slightly at her answer, and returned to the celebration, leaving Elena standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor for a moment, watching Matthias laugh with an old university friend, feeling, for the first time all day, that everything had genuinely turned out all right. Later that night, long after most of the guests had gone home, Elena and Matthias sat together on the edge of an empty balcony overlooking the palace gardens, still in their wedding clothes, shoes discarded somewhere nearby. "Some wedding day," Matthias said quietly, half laughing, half exhausted. "Could have been worse," Elena said. "At least the flowers held up." He laughed properly then, the tension of the day finally breaking, and pulled her close. "I love you," he said. "I'm sorry it took a scandal to remind me how much." "You didn't need reminding," she said. "I already knew." The full truth of what Isolde had done emerged gradually over the following weeks, pieced together through official statements, leaked audit reports, and eventually her own trial. It turned out Isolde's financial troubles had begun nearly 3 years earlier, long before Elena had even entered the family's life. Eager to prove herself as more than a ceremonial figurehead, she had taken direct control of the Aldenmark Children's Future Trust, a charitable fund that had supported education programs for underprivileged children for generations. Confident in her own judgment and reluctant to rely on the advisors around her, she began redirecting portions of the trust's funds into high-risk private investments, convinced she could significantly grow the charity's resources and cement her reputation as a capable, modern royal. The investments failed, slowly and steadily, over the following 18 months. Rather than admit the mistake and face the embarrassment of public failure, Isolde began covering the losses by moving money between accounts, forging the signatures of 2 trust officers whose approval was legally required for any major transaction. She convinced herself it was temporary, that she simply needed time to recover the losses quietly before anyone noticed. An anonymous letter, sent to the king's private financial counsel roughly 8 months before the wedding, first raised concerns about irregular activity within the trust. What followed was a careful, quiet investigation, conducted deliberately out of the public eye to avoid triggering a scandal before investigators had solid, undeniable proof. Isolde had no idea the investigation was even happening. She continued attending public events, continued making pointed comments to reporters about tradition and family duty, continued treating Elena with the same cool distance she always had, all while the evidence against her slowly, methodically came together behind closed doors. The investigation was fully complete just days before the wedding. The king and his closest advisors debated how to handle it, ultimately deciding to let the ceremony proceed undisturbed and deal with Isolde privately afterward, in a manner that would protect both the dignity of the crown and the sanctity of Elena and Matthias's wedding day. Isolde's decision to wear white and stage her dramatic entrance forced their hand entirely. Watching his own daughter publicly humiliate his son's bride in front of 800 guests and international press, the king made the decision himself, right there in the cathedral, to have her arrested immediately, rather than wait even one more day. Isolde was formally stripped of her royal title within a month of her arrest. Her trial, when it came, was a quiet, dignified affair, compared to the spectacle of her arrest, held largely behind closed doors out of respect for the ongoing legal proceedings. The evidence against her was overwhelming: forged signatures matched through forensic handwriting analysis, transaction logs showing the movement of funds between accounts, and testimony from the 2 trust officers whose names she had forged, both of whom described their shock at discovering approvals they had never actually given. Isolde maintained publicly, both during and after the trial, that she had been the victim of jealous advisors who wanted to see her fail. She never fully admitted wrongdoing, even as the evidence against her mounted. During one of the final hearings, when the prosecutor presented a side-by-side comparison of her handwriting against the forged signatures on the trust documents, Isolde reportedly stared at the papers for a long moment without saying anything at all, the confident expression she had worn throughout most of the trial finally slipping, just slightly, for the first time in front of the courtroom. Bernard, the elderly trust officer whose signature had been forged, testified quietly and without any visible anger, explaining simply that he had trusted her because he had known her since she was a child, and that trust, once broken that completely, was not something he expected to ever fully rebuild. His testimony, more than any financial document presented that week, seemed to affect Isolde the most. Observers in the courtroom noted she did not meet his eyes once during his entire statement. In the end, the court found her guilty on all major charges, sentencing her to several years of supervised probation, full financial restitution to the trust, and mandatory public oversight of any future assets or business dealings, a significant fall from the life of privilege she had always known. A week after the wedding, once the initial wave of headlines had begun to settle, Elena and Matthias left quietly for a short honeymoon at a small cottage on a remote stretch of coastline, deliberately chosen for having no cell signal and even less interest from the press. They spent their days walking along empty beaches, cooking simple meals themselves for the first time either of them could remember, and slowly, carefully, letting the tension of the wedding day fade into something they could finally laugh about rather than flinch away from. It was there, sitting on the porch one evening with 2 mugs of tea going cold beside them, that Matthias finally asked the question that had been sitting quietly between them since the cathedral doors closed behind the departing guards. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "Marrying into all of this?" Elena thought about it honestly before answering, the way she always did. "I regret that your sister made our wedding day about her problems instead of us," she said. "I don't regret you. I never will." He reached over and took her hand, and for a while neither of them said anything else. The ocean was loud enough to fill the silence just fine. Elena and Matthias, for their part, chose not to let the scandal define their marriage. They released a single brief, dignified statement thanking the public for their support and asking for privacy during what remained, despite everything, a difficult family matter. They declined every request for further interviews about the arrest itself, refusing to turn a painful family moment into ongoing public entertainment. Instead, Elena poured her energy into the charitable floral training program she had started quietly before the wedding, a project that taught young people from difficult backgrounds practical skills in flower cultivation and floral design, giving them a genuine trade to build a future around. With the backing of the royal family, the program expanded significantly over the following years, eventually opening training centers in 3 different cities across Aldenmark. Many of the program's graduates went on to open their own small shops, echoing, in their own way, the same simple beginning Elena herself once had on Harbor Street. Matthias, meanwhile, took on a more active role in the palace's financial oversight committees, partly in response to what his sister's actions had exposed about gaps in the trust's original approval systems. New safeguards were put in place, requiring multiple independent verifications for any significant transaction, a quiet but lasting change that came directly out of the painful lessons of that year. Bernard, despite everything, chose to stay on with the trust rather than resign, telling Elena once at a charity event that he preferred to be part of fixing the system rather than walking away from it entirely. He became one of the loudest advocates for the new oversight rules, determined that no one would ever again be able to quietly forge their way past the people meant to catch exactly that kind of mistake. Elena would laugh and remind him that she had only signed the paperwork. He was the one who had rewritten it from scratch, twice, until he was satisfied no one else could ever slip through the same gaps Isolde once had. The training program Elena built alongside the trust's renewed public trust grew steadily each year. What started as a handful of young people learning basic floral arrangement in a small rented space eventually became a respected vocational track recognized across the country, with graduates finding steady work not only in flower shops, but in event planning, landscaping, and small business ownership more broadly. Elena made a point of visiting each new training center personally at least once a year, often arriving unannounced, rolling up her sleeves, and working alongside the students for an afternoon exactly the way she used to work beside her mother. One young graduate, years later, told a local reporter that meeting Elena had changed how she thought about her own future entirely. "She didn't talk to us like someone doing charity," the young woman said. "She talked to us like someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to not have very much, and wanted better for us because of it, not because it looked good in a headline." The Queen, who had always quietly supported Elena from the very beginning, remained one of her closest confidants in the family, the two of them continuing their tradition of tea and honest conversation long after the wedding chaos had faded from the headlines. Elena's mother never quite got used to palace life, preferring to keep the flower shop on Harbor Street running herself, though she visited often, and Elena made a point of returning home at least once a month, working behind the counter for an afternoon just like she used to, much to the delight of longtime customers who still couldn't quite believe their local florist had become a princess. Years later, when a journalist finally managed to ask Elena, in a rare and carefully agreed-upon interview, about what had happened on her wedding day, she gave a simple, measured answer that would be quoted widely afterward. "I walked down that aisle for Matthias," she said. "Not for anyone watching, and not against anyone either. Everything that happened after that was never really about me at all. It was about choices other people made, long before I ever arrived. I just happened to be standing there when those choices finally caught up. The white gown Isolde wore that day was never seen publicly again. But the photograph taken as she was led from the cathedral in ceremonial chains remained one of the most widely circulated images in the country's history. a strange, permanent reminder that no title, however grand, and no gown, however carefully chosen, can shield anyone from the consequences of their own actions. Elena and Matthias went on to build a quiet, steady life together, one built less on the grandeur of the palace and more on the same simple values Elena had grown up with on Harbor Street: honesty, hard work, and the belief that real care, whether in a marriage or a bouquet of flowers, is something people can always tell the difference between. They had 2 children over the following years, both of whom grew up spending nearly as much time in their grandmother's flower shop on Harbor Street as they did in the palace gardens, much to Elena's quiet delight. She made a point of teaching them the same things her mother had once taught her: how to tell when a stem needed trimming, how to arrange colors so they complemented rather than competed, and most importantly, that the value of something rarely had anything to do with how much attention it demanded. Looking back, years later, Elena would sometimes think about how close she had come to turning around at the cathedral doors that morning, how easily fear could have won out over the 3 simple steps she had already taken. She never regretted continuing down that aisle, not for a single day afterward, but she also never pretended the moment had been easy. She had simply decided, in the space of a few heartbeats, that she would rather walk forward into an uncertain, complicated life with Matthias than walk backward into a safer, simpler one without him. It was, she often said, the easiest hard decision she ever made. Matthias, for his part, came to see that day differently over time as well. What had once felt to him like the worst possible thing that could happen on his wedding day slowly became, in his memory, proof of exactly the kind of partner he had chosen. Elena hadn't needed him to fix anything that morning. She hadn't needed rescuing. She had simply kept walking, steady and certain, and let everything else sort itself out around her. It was a quality he came to rely on more and more as the years passed, through quieter crises, and bigger ones alike. Isolde, for her part, largely disappeared from public life following her sentence. A few years later, a small local newspaper ran a brief, quiet story, noting that a woman matching her description had been seen volunteering at a community financial literacy program in a modest neighborhood far from the palace, though the report was never officially confirmed by the family, and no one asked her to comment. Whether it was true or not, Elena chose not to dwell on it either way. Some stories, she had learned, did not need a tidy ending to be finished. And every year, on their wedding anniversary, Elena still arranges the flowers herself.